Merci beaucoup, Marie. Euh, qu'il nous restera assez de temps pour poser quelques petites questions à la fin, mais je voudrais sans tarder donc donner la parole, si nous parvenons à nous connecter, à Elisabeth Emrich-Rougé. Est-ce qu'elle est présente? Oui? D'accord. Alors, juste en deux mots pour la présenter. Après ces deux exposés qui croisaient de façon différente la Chine et le Japon, d'ailleurs, c'était très intéressant de ce point de vue aussi. Elisabeth euh, actuellement mène ses recherches en doctorat en histoire de l'art et en visual studies à l'université de Cornell, donc aux États-Unis. Elle a été commissaire adjoint pour des expositions au Johnson Museum of Art de Cornell University entre 2005 et 2019, avec une spécialisation en histoire en art de l'Asie, pardon, entre 2017 et 2019. Et elle poursuit ses recherches sur notamment la xylographie, les impressions sur planche, et sur les relations entre l'art et la littérature en Chine. Je vais donc lui laisser la parole. Je crois qu'elle nous parle depuis Sheffield, au Royaume-Uni, n'est-ce pas? Vous êtes
Oui,
actuellement au Royaume-Uni. Voilà. Donc, merci. Nous allons donc écouter. Vous allez parler en anglais ou en français?
en anglais.
Anglais, d'accord, très bien. Donc,
Oui.
voici un exposé. Alors, désolé, il faudra tenir les 20 minutes au maximum, s'il vous plaît. Merci beaucoup. In 20 minutes, please.
Oui.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much for inviting me to join the conference today. I will share my screen. So, can everybody hear me all right? So today, yes, thanks. Today I'll be talking about Muke and Manhua, the transmedial exchange in socialist aesthetics, and the work of Li Hua and Chen Yanqiao. So this paper focuses on a particular set. Excuse me. I apologize. Let me out. There we go. Pardon. This paper focuses on a particular set of interactions during the 1930s, those between China's modern woodblock prints and the contemporaneous satirical cartoon movement, as demonstrated in the works by the artists Li Hua, Hong Shiying, Chen Yanqiao, and Luo Gusun. In what follows, I will demonstrate that contrary to the widely accepted historiography, transmedial exchange in subject matter, style, and aesthetics was occurring between woodcuts or Muke Manhua and cartoons, Manhua, during the 1930s. Furthermore, I argue that this transmedial exchange was a significant part of the broader appearance of what I have called a socialist aesthetic, which I see as emerging across printmaking, photography, literature, and film during the 1930s in Shanghai and actually beyond China as well. Notably, all the works under consideration here by Huang Shiying, Chen Yanqiao, and Luo Gusun, regardless of whether they were Muke or Manhua, were published in the magazine Cartoon Life, or Manhua Shenghua, which ran for 13 issues from September 1934 to September 1935 and was published in Shanghai. Although China Roar, which I will talk about in a bit, and Threshers, two of the works under consideration here by Li Hua, were not published in this magazine, multiple other works by that same artist were over the course of the publication's run. Along with the regular appearance of a column devoted to Muke, or woodblock prints, both foreign and domestic, in this same magazine, all of these instances of engagement indicate personal, political, and aesthetic connections between editors, woodcut artists, cartoonists, and their artwork, none of which have been satisfactorily explored in the existing literature. So the history of woodblock printmaking during the early 20th century in China has been pretty strongly codified, with the modern writer Lu Xun as its guiding figure. On the left, you see two works by Jiang Feng that are sort of representative examples. Among the works it is best known for are leftist images that highlighted the plight of the urban and rural poor, factory workers and demonstrators, and therefore the woodcut movement's history was indelibly tied to the early years of the Chinese Communist Party, its associated cultural organizations like the League of Left-Wing Writers, Zuolian, or the League of Left-Wing Artists, Meilian, and all of their activities. Ultimately, this historiography, though accurate, neglects to analyze these woodcuts' interactions with media outside of the usually repeated list of works that Lucian provided for these artists to study. In particular, it has remained silent on the aesthetic interaction of woodblock prints with either concurrent modernist art trends or with other media, including literature, film, painting, or cartooning, even though individual artists' choices in stylistic execution and editors' choices in image reproductions and juxtapositions clearly show stylistic exchange going on at the time. In counterpoint, recent publications on the history of the Manhua movement in China have focused on expanding our understanding of these illustrations' interaction with a broad range of media, especially contemporaneous literature and modern art. By the 1930s, these Manhua artists and many others had embarked on what has come to be known as the golden age of Manhua, with dozens of cartoon publications appearing over the course of the decade and an unprecedented expansion of what the term Manhua encapsulated. While earlier iterations of the concept referred directly to line drawing and comic strips, by the late 1920s and 1930s, Manhua had also come to refer to images that incorporated photography, drawn illustrations, advertisements, and typography. Cartoon artists, while circulating these varied compositions in print publications, were also involved in other artistic activities and interests which affected the formal qualities and aesthetics of their visual works. However, the research into the connections between cartoons and woodcuts has been lacking. Instead, woodcut artists have generally been portrayed as more politically engaged, while cartoon artists are more likely to be dismissed as pandering to lowbrow humor and the interests of petty urbanites. While in some ways understandable because of the Manhua publication's heavy reliance on the female nude to increase magazine circulation, as you see here on the left, Liu Xiaofei's cover of modern sketch 时代漫画 satirically uses an image of the female nude in order to make fun of how she is used as an object of entertainment. Whereas in the same magazine, on the inside, is the series of cartoons in a similar style to George Grosz by Lu Zhixiang called The Heart of the Metropolis, where he's talking about the conditions of workers within factory workers in urban centers. Finally, the bifurcation of these two histories is even more surprising, given that cartoons and woodcuts were often published in the same journals and magazines, for example, in Cartoon Life or Manhua Shenghua, and as I will argue, shared subject matters, formal stylistic similarities, and in some cases, what I call a particular socialist aesthetic. And I will talk about the specific characteristics of that socialist aesthetic as we discuss the examples. So my first comparison is the work of Li Hua here, China Roar on the left and Huang Shiying's Life's Outcry on the right. At first glance, Li Hua's China Roar and Huang Shiying's Life's Outcry already appear quite similar formally and in their emotional efficacy. And furthermore, Li Hua's imaging of bodily outcry, as Xiaobing Tang has beautifully elucidated, can be seen as part of a larger literary and visual movement centered around the theme of vocal expression, national salvation. However, I will argue here that beyond that, it is these particular compositions' openness to multiple and varied interpretations that is crucial to the representation of both the connections between Manhua and Muke and the socialist aesthetic that I'm claiming they embody. Crucially, they share a lack of specific context, meaning that they become a canvas onto which the viewer, the reader, can project their own societal concerns. In the case of the leftist woodblock print movement, This last bit is particularly notable, given that the prints, both at the time and in later historiography, were supposed to focus stringently on what they called as the portrayal of reality, an indexical rather than metaphorical representation, and furthermore, a rigidly codified one. Arguably the most well-known example of China's modern woodcut movement, Li Hua's China Roar, was originally published in the December 1935 issue of the journal Modern Prints, or Xiandai Banhua, printed by Li Hua's on Modern Print Society, which was made up of himself and students from the Guangzhou Municipal Art Academy. Published without any accompanying explanatory text or even preface to the issue, a straightforward reading of this image, given the title in the context of 1935, could first see it as a metaphorical depiction of China, bound and struggling against foreign imperialism, particularly that of Japan, and blind to the tools it could use to free itself. An alternative reading could see the figure again as China, but this time caught in the bondage of a vicious, corrupt, and weak government, i.e. the Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang, and blind to the liberatory potential of the Communist Party. Finally, as Xiaobingtang has pointed out, the print could also function to be an image of the audience's subjectivity and their need and desire or duty to be vocal in support of the Chinese nation. In counterpoint to this relative freedom of information, freedom of interpretation, Li Hua had printed another woodcut 3 months previously in a different collection titled Threshers, that by dint of its title and depiction notably foreclosed the same sorts of multiple readings. Though similar to China Roar in its abstracted depiction of the human body, its emaciated figures, its emotional efficacy, and its screaming subject, the combination of title and background served to provide the viewer with a very specific, more indexical depiction of two individual agricultural workers in a rice field, angry and desperate. In this, Li's Threshers is much more akin to the classical notion of what leftist woodblock prints were supposed to do, depict the reality of the downtrodden in society so as to highlight their plight and bring attention to it. On the right, Wang Shiying's Life's Outcry, meanwhile, is similarly open to interpretation, but on a more local level. Published as the cover image to the first issue of Cartoon Life, or Manhua Shenghua, for which Wang Shiying was the editor, along with Wulang Xi. Huang is using his subject to attract consumers to purchase the magazine, as well as to represent the thematic content of the issue. Again, multiple interpretations are possible. Given the incidence and severity of recent floods in China during the 1930s, one possible interpretation is that this figure is a flood survivor, having returned home to the destruction of his farm and death of family or neighbors. An alternate reading, given the main figure's emaciated frame and ragged clothing, is that he is a famine or plague victim, giving voice to his frustration and hunger through screaming. And finally, as Nick Stember notes, the scenes of ruin with which the figure is surrounded and his resulting anguish may very well have reminded residents of Jiabei, an area outside of central Shanghai, of their neighborhood's recent bombing by the Japanese in 1932. Ultimately, my point here is that in the case of both China Roar and Life's Outcry, there is a clear reading available to the viewer, but there are still multiple clear readings that are quite open to interpretation. So, having established the functional resonance between Muke and Manhua as represented in the work of Li Hua and Wang Shiying, finally, I'll address why, outside of historiographic revisionism, we should see that as important. The socialist aesthetic I mentioned above is, I argue, constituted through three characteristics. First, an emotionally affective subject, which we see here. Second, a sense of veracity, but not necessarily realism in the depiction of those bodies or that subject. And third, a symbolic quality in which the individual or topic depicted serves as representative of a collective. In both China Roar and Life's Outcry, each of those criteria are met. Their depictions of sympathetic subjects were designed to elicit an emotional response on the part of the viewer. In each case, they communicate a sense of the truthfulness of the depiction or of the situation it purported to represent. And finally, they both demonstrate the multiple ways in which the central figure of those works can stand in for a collective of individuals, whether downtrodden peasants, starving urban beggars, politically engaged artists, or sympathetic urbanites. While I've argued that China Roar and Life's Outcry are representative of the under-recognized linkages between woodcuts and cartooning through their stylistic and functional similarities, I will now turn to a different sort of transmedial exchange, that between film, photography, cartooning, and printmaking, as represented in the work of the printmaker Chen Yanqiao and the photographer and manhua artist Luo Gusun. In what follows, I argue that the stylistic motif of photo collage and montage were used by these two artists to focus viewers' attention on specific aspects of their work and to heighten the emotional intensity of their compositions. And ultimately, it is in Chen Yanqiao's woodcut in the factory seen here on the left that I identify another example of the socialist aesthetic in action, again published in the pages of the Manhua cartoon magazine, Cartoon Life. Stylistically speaking, in the factory's most obvious debt is to photo collage and montage aesthetics, which quite common in cartoons and film and magazine layouts, was still comparatively rare in woodcut movements during the 1930s. In writing concerning theories of montage, found both in Shanghai's general interest and film-centric publications, authors discussed how to apply the technique of montage to film and how it would affect the film's emotional resonance with the audience. Their application to photographic montage is quite clear. Rather than a series of images that are simply captured on camera, these works are creatively constructed in order to highlight a particular element or to drive home a point. This reliance on fragmentation and juxtaposition in order to push forward political emotion in montage and photo collage compositions, as found in the pages of Cartoon Life, certainly reflected this approach to image making as well. In the case of Luo Gusun's photo collaged compositions from the November 1934 issue of Manhua Shenghuo, these two works were designed to be seen side by side in an obvious social critique of the vast difference in quality of life for the wealthy in urban centers and for the poor in the countryside. Clearly, Luo was criticizing those with wealth and power for their vacuous purchases when so many in the countryside were in dire need of assistance. In the case of droughts, floods, and banditry forcing the countryside into bankruptcy, the work on the right, the old man's figure, his gaze angled away from the viewers, is outlined in black against a background of disparate scenes, each of which show a possible aspect of the hardship in his life or in his family's life. However, in counterpoint, luxuries in the year of women's national goods, on the left, the female figure is looking directly out at the viewer, inviting their gaze as if she too is a commodity. A radio, perfumes, and a car surround her, intimating the kinds of objects that she might purchase. Ultimately, with these two works, the composition as a whole is devoted to publicizing the plight of the poor and disenfranchised, and criticizing the complicity of wealthy urbanites. And furthermore, Luo has captured the audience's attention through two avenues. First, that indexical quality that I talked about before. Here it shows up in these photographs where they provide the documentary proof of the objects one would find among the possessions of a rich woman doing her national duty to purchase luxury items, and also proof of the daily conditions of the destitute in the countryside. Secondly, the artist's construction of the composition's various parts is full of eye-catching contrasts, both within the individual pages as well as across the gutter of the magazine, all of which are anchored by the two central figures. So ultimately, the photo collage's impact rests on the artist's ability to highlight those main figures that we see here. So this pair of photo collage manhua, or others like them, I believe may have provided a model for Chen Yanqiao, whose application of photo collage to printmaking would be published in the same magazine the following year. Aside from the obvious placement of image fragments in overlapping angles and perspectives, the influence of photo collage in Chen's In the Factory is particularly apparent in the silhouetting of the human figure against the flat black ground on the right side of the print. Chen's white outline, echoing the black outline around the beggar in Luo Gusun's photo collage, is necessary compositionally so that the outline of the worker's body appears in the print, but it also highlights the constructed overlapping nature of the images. In other words, here, Chen is consciously imitating the appearance of photo collage. On the top and right-hand sides of the print, large geometric fields of black hem in the sides of the scene, creating a claustrophobic effect that is in fact antithetical to the desired effect in contemporaneous photographs of cavernous, clean, modern factory interiors from which Chen likely drew in the creation of this work. Furthermore, Chen's main figure standing at the bottom right is clearly suffering, both emotionally and physically. There's an obvious and pointed contrast between the grand, imposing symbols of urban industrial modernity and the dejected human figures that toil among them. So why did Chen make this composition as a woodblock print and not as a photo collage? Looking at In the Factory as exemplifying a socialist aesthetic provides us with an avenue to pursue answers to those questions. The photographic images that Chen would have appropriated to create this print were most likely modernist images of factory interiors, a combination of potentially similar photography can be found in an article on the Soviet automobile industry from the January 1933 issue of USSR in Construction. This, by the way, pictorial was in circulation in Shanghai at this time. However, the cartoons filling the pages of cartoon life were ambivalent towards their surrounding modern urban context, and in order to critique various aspects of it, often appropriated images like these documentary photographs that are seen in USSR in Construction that appeared to celebrate that modernity. And then the cartoon artists undermined their meaning through contrast and comparison and photo collage. So here, Chen has emulated that approach. By appropriating propagandistic modernist photography of industrial spaces and then reorganizing fragments into a woodblock print, he is first critiquing the photography's documentary aspect and organizing the photographic fragments as a framing device for the urban worker. Ultimately, I think Chen's emphasis is on the emotional efficacy of the composition. The readership of Cartoon Life would have been aware of the reputation of woodblock printmaking by 1935. The print, with all that it embodied as an artistic medium, i.e. leftist political views, social critique, sympathy for the plight of the urban poor, was a more effective medium for the direct transmission of Chen's critique than photo collage would have been, as a result of the audience's prior familiarity with the print medium, with woodblock printing and what it represented. Placing In the Factory within a wider context, I further argue that this print is also an example of the global socialist aesthetic mentioned above, because here Chen has first provided his viewer with an emotionally affective subject in the figure of the factory worker. Second, he's given us a sense of veracity, paradoxically through his recreation of pieces of photographs that were originally meant to be documentary. And third, Chen's main figure is representative of more than just himself. He is representative of a collective, in this case made up of urban workers of the proletariat, alienated by their industrial surroundings and through the lack of control over the conditions of their lives. Well,
sorry.
Go ahead. Yep.
It's almost finished, or because we're really in lack of time. Sorry for that.
It's all right.
Thank you.
Sorry, so yeah, we can finish there if you'd like.
Les trois interventions étaient passionnantes et je suis sûre que vous aviez des tas de questions à poser, mais malheureusement, je crois que nous allons passer à la session suivante aussitôt. À la fin de la session, quand tout sera terminé, vous pourrez bien sûr attendre les intervenants pour leur poser des questions. Ensuite, en sortant de cette salle, ce sera toujours possible. Excusez-nous, donc Madame Molita, donc Madame Loreillard, et puis donc Madame Emrich-Rougé, et donc à très bientôt et pour la prochaine session qui va commencer à 14h30 tout de suite avec Julien Bouvard et sous la présidence de Marie Loreillard. Donc c'est une journée très dense, mais merci de rester présent.